Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Bill Herbert. I'm president of the Capital District chapter of the Labor Employment Relations Association, known as LIRA. On behalf of LIRA, I would like to thank the Rockefeller Institute for co-sponsoring this event entitled Colloquium on New York's Fiscal Condition and Public Sector Labor Relations. For those who don't know, LIRA is a national organization comprised of professionals in the field of labor relations, including neutrals, academics, and representatives of both unions and employers. It seeks to interface practitioners with the best thinkers in academia with respect to labor and employment issues. Our LIRA chapter over the past 2 years has had a number of diverse programs, including programs on green jobs, workplace issues involving social media, the use of DNA identification technology in employment. We've co-sponsored the celebration of the NLRB's 75th anniversary at Albany Law School. We also took a wonderful tour of the historic Waterville Armory and learned about their labor management practices. I mean, if you're interested in joining LIRA chapter, you can fill out a form if you haven't already, or you can email us at lira.capitaldistrict@gmail.com. We have two upcoming events that you may be interested in. On Wednesday, April 20th, we have a program on the arbitration of discrimination claims, perspectives from an arbitrator and two advocates. And on May 24th, we have a program on current issues and workplace investigations, questions, answers, and discussion. I've also been asked to mention two other events in Albany that this audience may be interested in, both involving the centennial of the Triangle Fire tragedy. The first is there's going to be an event at the State Museum on March 25th involving the fire and the events. You may be interested in that. I think there are flyers downstairs. Also, there's an event early that day at 1 o'clock called Triangle Fire, a centennial event in public health, labor, and women's history. Appropriate, yesterday was International Women's Day. So when our LIRA chapter was considering programs this year, we were unanimous that a program where we could have Frank Mauro and E.J. McMahon, moderated by Bob Ward, would be timely, elevated, and engaging. Little did we know at the time how extraordinary our timing would be in light of events taking place nationwide, especially in the past 2 months. So I'd like to introduce our speakers and moderator. If you listen carefully now, because I've read their bios, and I'll give you a short bio, you'll see that these gentlemen are not strangers to each other. Although they have traveled similar paths, they have reached somewhat different conclusions. So to my left is Frank Mauro. Frank is Executive Director of the Fiscal Policy Institute. Prior to joining the Fiscal Policy Institute in 1993, Frank was Deputy Director of the Rockefeller Institute. Previously, he served as Director of Research for the last major revision of the New York City Charter, and before that as Secretary of the Assembly Ways and Means Committee. To his right is E.J. McMahon. E.J. is Senior Fellow at the McMahon Institute and its Albany-based Empire Center for New York State Policy. Previously, he served as Deputy Commissioner for Tax Policy at the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, and was Director of Minority Staff for the Assembly Ways and Means Committee, and Director of Research for the Public Policy Institute. Our moderator tonight is Bob Ward. As I said, they're all connected. Just listen to Bob's bio and you see how interconnected they are. Bob is now Deputy Director of the Rockefeller Institute. Remember, Frank used to be the Deputy Director of the Rockefeller Institute. Bob heads the Institute.
Follow, by the way.
Bob heads the Institute's New York State Studies as well as its National Studies of State and Local Government. Bob has studied and written about New York State government for 25 years, both in his current position as well as assistant to the chairman of the Assembly and Ways and Means Committee. So all three of them have served on that committee, and previously was a Director of Research of the Public Policy Institute, where I failed to mention that E.J. used to be the head of it. So we have three individuals with a lot of knowledge today. Bob is kind enough to play the role of moderator, and we thank him very much.
Thank you, Bill, and I want to welcome everyone to the Rockefeller Institute on behalf of Tom Gaze, our director, and everyone else here at the Institute. And I know, in fact, there are some folks here who have been involved with the Institute in years before, not only Frank, but some others, and we feel lucky to be here. It's a special place, and we're honored that the Labor Employment Relations Association wanted to do this event here. I want to also start by thanking, I'm a SUNY employee. I'm also partly a Research Foundation employee, for those of you who keep score. on these things. And I want to thank my fellow public employees for keeping the sidewalk in front of the Rockefeller Institute so nice and clear of snow and ice. And I think we can thank the city workers, City of Albany. Whether they do quite as good a job, we'll talk about later. But that's beside the point. I just want to start out with a couple of sort of fundamental observations that I think are important and useful to keep in mind as we talk about the budget and public employee labor relations. First of all, obviously, while we will focus largely on the state when we talk about the budget, we're really talking about state and local governments. And I think most people here are well aware of the interplay between the state budget and local governments and the extent to which the legislature and the governor can direct the activities of local governments. And people have different perspectives on sometimes on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, or in which ways it might be good or bad. But there's an awful lot of overlap, and that's sort of one of the, again, fundamental realities that is worth keeping in mind. Secondly, state and local governments, both in New York and nationally, are very labor-intensive enterprises. So that if you look at the numbers nationwide, somewhere between 35 and 40% of all state and local expenditures are on payroll and benefits. And when we look particularly at schools or local governments, again, a great majority of the payroll is related to the cost of employee compensation. So when budgets are tight, one way to look at it is that you essentially have three choices. You can raise revenues, you can reduce expenditures by reducing the number of employees, or you can reduce the cost of employment by reducing the unit cost of each employee. There are other sort of wrinkles within each of those, but in terms of the macro picture, I think that's sort of where we are. And here in New York, and as well as in other states, we've heard proposals that fall into each of those categories, and our speakers tonight have different views on those. But we are going to start off the agenda this evening with opening comments from Frank and EJ about the state budget as the overall context for what we're talking about, and then I will follow that with some questions, and we plan to have some questions from all of you folks afterward. Again, we know there are many very knowledgeable people in the room, so we look forward to that. And Frank, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I should turn this on, right?
Very good idea.
Yeah. Okay. So it should sound louder now?
Yes.
Yeah, very loud. Wow. Okay. We're going to talk about the budget situation the state faces. I think there's an underlying fundamental situation, which is the economy, and so I think that's the main cause of the problem the states are facing. But from an accounting perspective, the more sort of immediate cause is that the two main ways that the federal government and New York State government tried to reduce the amount of budget cutting that had to be done are expiring. That it wasn't anticipated that the downturn would be as long or as deep as it was. And then there's some longer-term driving forces that really made us more vulnerable. So I'll start with the first of those, which is the economy. I think the problem the states are facing generally is the recession. State revenues, not just in New York, but nationally, in effect fell off a cliff. If it wasn't for the temporary income tax increase that New York State enacted in 2009, according to the Budget Division, personal income tax revenues between 2007 and 2009 would have declined by $8 billion. So an $8 billion fall off in personal income tax revenues. A bigger fall off compared to what they were anticipating, because in Governor Spitzer's first year in 2007, they made commitments for a statewide settlement of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit, implemented a multi-year commitment to a real property tax circuit breaker. So they made some multi-year commitments which were counting on revenues increasing, not decreasing, but revenues absolutely decreased. So I think that's the main economic driver of what's going on. in terms of approximate sense, there are two sort of temporary fixes that turned out to be shorter than this recession called for. The federal government, in recognition of the problems the states were facing, included within the stimulus package, the $787 billion stimulus package, included $135 billion that was explicitly for state fiscal relief, explicitly for the purpose of reducing the amount of budget cutting that the states had to do, primarily in two areas: in healthcare through the Medicaid program, and in education through something called the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. The federal government provided that relief for 2 years. There was a temporary extension last August for about 6 months, but that fiscal relief is expiring, and the Budget Division estimates that as a result of the Medicaid and education relief expiring, $5.4 billion of costs revert to the general fund. So there had been $5.4 billion of costs in the year that we're finishing that were covered by extraordinary level of federal funds to get through the recession, and those are expiring. The same thing happened in the earlier part of the decade, but the timing worked out better. In 2003, in May of 2003, President Bush signed a 2-year state fiscal relief package into law, and that dovetailed better with the recovery of the state revenue systems. But what's happening in this recession is the state revenue systems are not recovering in a time frame that allows them to adequately pick up the slack from the expiring of the federal fiscal relief. Some people say, well, they shouldn't have had the federal fiscal relief in the first place, that the states should have bitten more bullets. But I think that would have been terrible for the economy. The situation would have been even worse than it was if we had even greater layoffs. The second, what the state did itself to reduce the amount of budget cutting it had to do, is it enacted a temporary income tax increase on top rates for calendar years 2009, 2010, and 2011. And that also helped to reduce the amount of damage to be done to the economy during that recession. But that is expiring at the end of calendar year 2011. So both the major federal action and the major state action, I think, were good. And if there are questions about that, because I think some people will disagree with me, we can talk about that later. But I would like to just, before I finish, just turn to the longer term causes. In the long term, Governor Patterson, you used to repeat constantly, we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. I think that there were two problems with what he was saying. One, the numbers he used to say we have a spending problem were conveniently chosen to exaggerate the rate of spending increase. Counted from 2002-2003 to 2008, and it was a period of time when the expenditures in 2002-2003 were artificially deflated by the fact that we rolled over $1.9 billion of bills from 02-03 to 03-04. So there was games playing going on. But on the revenue side, he ignores the fact that from 1994, Governor Cuomo's last year, for the first 6 years, each of the first 6 years of Governor Pataki's term, in all 7 of those years, multi-year backloaded tax cuts were enacted, and Governor Pataki estimated in the year he left that they were reducing state revenue by about $20 billion. What my estimate is given that the economy has declined, and his estimates were based on not just the phasing in of more and more tax cuts, but also the fact that income was growing, and so a tax cut was worth more money. My estimate is if those tax cuts hadn't been made, compared to where we are now, taking the current economic situation into consideration, the temporary income tax increase, and the parts of the tax package that have been repealed, one part of it was repealed, we would have $13.5 billion more in revenue this year. So I would argue that Governor Patterson was wrong, that at the very least we have as much of a revenue problem as we have as a spending problem, and I think the problem is greater on the revenue side. Thank you.
Thank Thanks, Frank. EJ, what's the starting point for thinking about the relationship of the budget and public-employee relations?
Well, I would, starting with the state level, I would look at it from a slightly different perspective, actually a starkly different perspective than Frank. Because I do think it was I know that's going to shock you, that it is a spending problem. I would point out the following. When Governor Patterson presented his first budget in December 2008, he was projecting a series of growing budget gaps that would reach about $14.5 billion by the current fiscal year. Now, it turns out the budget is roughly balanced in this current fiscal year. How is that? We have that figure $14.5 billion in your head. Where did the $14.5 billion come from to close the budget gap? After the governor released the budget, three things happened. One, federal government gave the state, in terms of the temporary stimulus Frank talked about, an amount that this year totaled about $6.5 billion, a little over $6.5 billion. The state raised taxes and fees by a total of over $7 billion, about $4 billion of which was the temporary personal income tax hike. So there you have 13.5. The rest was spending restraint, increases at lower rates than the baseline would have called for. If you count the stimulus as if it was state money, which it was temporarily displaced, you had continued spending growth throughout this period. Now you've arrived at this wall. The stimulus is gone, which, by the way, the bill was only 2.5 years worth of money. It's gone, almost completely gone in the coming fiscal year. The expiration of the temporary income tax increase has a revenue impact in the coming fiscal year of $1 billion, which is 1/10 of the proposed projected budget gap. So that's what that situation is. But I think in terms of talking about this in the context of collective bargaining, I think it's really important to look at this with a broader perspective. I don't think you can look at the state budget in a vacuum. I don't think you can look at this, or rather, I don't think you can think of this collective bargaining and then look only at the state budget problem. When the state catches a cold, everybody else sneezes, and vice versa. This is a problem for every level of government in New York, including those levels of government that are not directly heavily dependent on state aid. For instance, school districts being the most dependent on state aid, towns and cities, towns in particular, being arguably the least dependent on state aid, direct infusions of money. But they all are affected by the combined effects of the economic downturn and its lingering effects on tax revenue, and by the delayed impact on the state budget, which this year is going to be cut by the amounts that weren't cut in previous years. Because the state budget has become untracked from its permanent revenue base. And unless you do a permanent significant increase in revenues, which Frank and I probably disagree on the advisability of, you've got to reduce permanent spending by billions of dollars, and that has to affect local governments as well as the state government itself. And then I come back to the point Bob made, which is personnel is the largest part of expenditures for municipalities and school districts in particular. Less so for counties, although in terms of counties' discretionary expenditures, it's also a fairly large part of their discretionary expenditures. As you know, personnel is a relatively small part of the state budget if you view it in its all-funds totality of $130 billion. But it's not an insignificant amount of money. It is, the states, I think it's roughly $14 billion. I didn't double check before I came, Frank. What is it, about $14 billion payroll total personal service?
I don't think so, but I don't have the numbers.
Think it's higher or lower?
Oh, I think it's lower than that.
Okay, well maybe 12.
I don't know.
But it's a lot of money. And what happens on the state level can have implications for the local level depending on whether a governor seeks structural reforms or not, which I presume we'll talk about tonight. So I think, again, my bottom line is I would view the state government's problem from the broader perspective of all governments in New York, and how the responses to that problem have implications for all levels of government in New York.
Let the record show that there are some things that even EJ, McMahon, and Frank Mauro don't know at the top of their head.
It's the concepts that are more important.
Exactly. Right. You can always look it up.
There'll be no test there.
But you both talked about the rate of spending increase, and Frank, you mentioned that Governor Patterson's criticisms of, he said the state, the increase in spending has been unsustainable, and we've heard that from some others, including Governor Cuomo. EJ, let me start with you, and then Frank, we'll go back to you. How do we know what the appropriate rate of spending increase is, either in a given year or over time? Should we compare it to inflation? Should we compare it to personal income? Should we attempt to find some measure of need? We obviously do it based on whatever we can do in a given year.
Right. Well,
but that tends to get us into trouble. So is there any metric that we should apply and try to stick to over time?
Well, you beat me to it, because I was going to say, of course, the simplest starting point is that the appropriate level of spending is not more than you actually have. The second simplest is to look at what you have on what's called a structural basis. What is your recurring revenue? What is it likely to be in the future? And compare it to where your spending is headed. And I think in that case, I think that's where we've fallen short repeatedly. We don't do a tight enough job of regularly updating our financial plan or of insisting that it really be in line with reality. Now, Governor Cuomo has kind of attacked this from an odd perspective. You may recall that at the beginning of the year, right before he put out his budget, Governor Cuomo announced that he had made the shocking discovery that he was revealing to New Yorkers that, do you know that the budget gap is based in part on assumed spending growth, and that this assumed spending growth is way beyond inflation? I'm shocked to discover that this is going on here. And at that point, somebody came from behind and handed him his winnings from this roulette wheel, I guess. But I think that was a bit of a stagey presentation of an interesting issue, which is how do you treat the baseline? Now, what he has proposed doing is taking the baseline and bending it flatter, linking school aid growth to personal income, and linking the growth in Medicaid, notwithstanding everything else going on in Medicaid, to healthcare inflation, whatever that is. I don't know what particular metric he would use. Now that's an interesting idea. That's his way of determining what is or is not excessive spending. We've heard less about that in recent weeks as these guys have gotten closer to an attempt to resolve the budget. But it will be interesting going forward to see to what extent the final budget attempts to enforce those numbers. Because, of course, in addition to those numbers, he's proposed a cap on property tax growth, which is itself a self-limiting mechanism, particularly for school districts, since the cap could be enforced by voters. So ultimately, I think that the level of spending, again, it has to be what you can afford. It has to be what you can afford in the long term, and preferably should be less than what you can afford in the long term, a lot less.
How do we know how much to spend?
I think that if you come up with the idea of an artificial yardstick, that spending should, say that the state government spending should grow by the rate of inflation or by the rate of personal income growth, what you can never do is change the way anything is financed. For example, the state, in response to effective lobbying by the county executives, capped the growth in the county share of Medicaid costs to reduce that pressure on the property tax. So state spending isn't just growing by what the activities were before that were growing. It also had a new obligation. The campaign for fiscal equity settlement is similar. There was a lawsuit. The legislature wasn't able to reach an agreement for a while. Finally, in Governor Spitzer's first year, he put forth a plan for a statewide settlement, even though the lawsuit dealt only with New York City. It made a multi-year commitment to increase spending on education with a focus on leveling up the resources in the neediest districts. So it was a multi-year commitment to increase what was referred to as foundation aid, which was the block granting of the former largest block grant, operating aid, with a number of categorical programs that were eliminated, and it was supposed to grow over 4 years by $5.5 billion to reach the target that they agreed on, that the governor and the legislature agreed on for New York City. And many other needy districts had substantial increases as well. So I think from a societal perspective, the multi-year commitment that the governor and the legislature made was good. But from a budget balancing perspective, I think what the criticism could be is they didn't pay for it. they in effect assumed that the current revenue system would grow fast enough not just to cover the increasing cost of what they were already doing, but this additional cost. Now, is it wrong to make a policy decision like the Campaign for Fiscal Equity Settlement? I don't think it's wrong. Perhaps there were some things that people who care more about targeting of the aid, like I do, might have said, well, you could have saved a little money if you didn't do what Governor Spitzer said and give everybody a 3% increase each year, because that sort of created a additional cost without meeting the heart of the lawsuit case. Let's say that you want to reduce pressure on the property tax and have the state take over an increasing share of the cost of schools. You could never do something like that if your yardstick was that state spending shouldn't grow more than the rate of inflation. I think that it would be better, but still artificial, if you had a global assessment for state and local spending together, but you still have the vagaries of the economy and federal aid. So I think that the government has to spend as little as it can to do what needs to be done. It needs to do what it does efficiently, but an artificial yardstick like saying spending should increase by the rate of inflation should not be, and I don't think it will be, a justification to the courts that the state doesn't have to guarantee a sound basic education to all children.
On the other hand, the court did say there is some level of funding that is appropriate for New York City schools. We're not there, we need to get there. And I forget the specifics, but either by implication or perhaps in the decision itself, the suggestion was that that's the level we should be at and stay at over time with some, presumably, elevator.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So that is some fixture in terms of a level of spending, whether it's
right. Well, not exactly, because when the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case went to the Court of Appeals 3 times over the course of a decade, and what Governor Pataki won in the final decision in early December of 2006, right as his term was ending, he had argued that the courts can tell us that what we're doing is unconstitutional and we need to provide an adequate level of resources. But they can't tell us what to do. They have to allow the government to make that decision, and then if it turns out that we didn't do it right, they can say again that we're wrong. But they can't order a settlement. But they also said, in a decision which I think was to give all the parties a little bit, but Governor Pataki, you yourself said there should be an increase of at least $1.93 billion in 2002-2003 terms, so it should be at least what you said. But the main thing they were deciding is that the legislature and the governor had the authority to decide. And the plan that the legislature and the governor put in did have an inflation adjustment, and whether it had the inflation adjustment or not, with the level of resources that they were phasing in, by not providing additional revenue to cover them, it was the dilemma that I talked about earlier, that they were anticipating that the existing revenue system would grow enough to cover not just the increasing cost of what we're doing now, but this new commitment. So I think that in terms of a structural sense, we have made some important commitments, some of which I would agree with, some of which I wouldn't, but that we didn't pay for. But you can't ignore the fact that from 94 to 2000, we had these 7 consecutive years of multi-year backloaded tax cuts that are still reducing revenue today.
You want to make a point on that, BJ?
Well, I don't want to. We'll end up enmeshed in numbers. I mean, as a share of the economy and personal income, I don't think taxes are that much lower than they were in the mid-'90s. I think Pataki was elected on a commitment to reduce those taxes. I think they were, in fact, largely paid for, those tax cuts. And I think that the imbalances we're talking about now don't stem from those tax cuts, but from the spending that occurred after all of those tax cuts had been fully phased in. I would note that in terms of a turning point, Eliot Spitzer was the first governor since Franklin Roosevelt in 1929 to take office at the peak of an economic expansion, right when it was about to tip into a decline. Not only was it was obviously the peak of an economic expansion. People were already writing about the bubble then. And his first budget was constructed as if there was no such thing as an economic cycle, much less a catastrophic historic financial crisis just down the road. And he was not alone, not to blast him. Governors across the country, to different degrees, budgeted the same way. Arnold Schwarzenegger in California postured as the solution to the problems he was elected to fix, borrowed like $15 billion or something, lived off it, didn't reduce spending, and you see the result now. Illinois is just nightmarish bad decisions. Jersey too. Jersey spent faster than we did and raised taxes more than we did permanently, and they're in worse shape. And on a per capita basis, they are wealthier. So when you politicians do things with their eyes, with both eyes, locked in the rearview mirror. Tomorrow can always take care of itself. And the problem is when that blows up on the state level, then it has cascading effects down to the local level.
All right, so the budget has blown up. And for the last year, or well over the last year, the governor and the legislature have been dealing with it in different ways. And one of the things that is commonly said in New York and in other states is that public employee compensation is a big part of the problem. Is that a fair thing to say, Frank?
If it means that public employee compensation is too high, I don't think it's a fair thing to say. I think the focus in this recession has been on raises of recent years, and over the longer term, I think that what's been happening in recent years is that public employee compensation is catching up. When you take a longer haul, what our analysis shows that over the last 2 decades, average annual private wage increases outpaced wage gains by state workers 4.2% to 3.4% is the calculation we've done for the last 2 decades. So I think in the long run, we don't have that. And so it's an ironic situation that during the early part of the recession, there were job reductions and wage freezes in the private sector. Now, the private sector economy is trying to gain traction on recovery, and there are substantial state and local government reductions. And so as the private economy is trying to gain traction in a tenuous recovery, state and local spending is being cut and putting a drag on that recovery. Recent study of almost 400 large corporations by one of the major human resources consulting firms, overwhelmingly firms are ending wage freezes and going to increases this year and next year, and government is a step behind. I think the governor is fighting the last war, so to speak. I think that he's trying to get substantial budget cuts, including some that will be bad for the economy, like bad for the economy in both the short run and the long run, like in effect, keeping the Campaign for Fiscal Equity commitment on the books, but subjecting it to a gap elimination adjustment that renders it irrelevant over the next few years. So I think that he's attempting to sell that based on the fact that times have been bad, and he is in effect saying they're going to continue to be bad. We don't know if they're going to continue to be bad. I think it would be a mistake to make the kind of long-term commitments he's proposing right now to renege on the Campaign for Fiscal Equity settlement on the basis of what I think is very uncertain situation right now. I think that this is similar to what happened in the early 1990s, that there were years of retrenchment, and then just on a dime, they switched and started cutting taxes at an incredible rate.
Okay.
Well, I guess Frank said the government is a step behind in terms of wage improvements. There was a period of several quarters in a row, I lost count of how many, during the recession, when private sector compensation in real and nominal terms declined. While private sector compensation was declining, public sector compensation, state and local government in particular, was continuing to increase at its previous trajectory for a good 6 or 7 quarters into the recession. So what you now have is a situation, for instance, as measured by the School Boards Association, the average teacher salary increase, including STEP, was over 5% through the recession. So now you're at a point where, yes, the private sector economy, the economy in general, hit bottom a little over a year ago, I guess, officially, is slowly recovering. Private sector compensation is slowly recovering. For most of us, it's the first time in memory that we lived through the kind of recession where nominal pay in the private sector went down. A lot of us had our salaries cut. And that had been experienced before. The only bad economy most of us had previously had was in the 70s when there was inflation, so it kind of masked it. So that happened, and the public sector compensation by and large did not. Now there's a lag effect because public sector compensation, in effect, was pumped up in large part by the stimulus money and by other measures taken by governments, particularly New York did much more in tax increases than most places. Now, as spending is being adjusted to fit where the economy actually is, there's belated efforts that have the effect of compressing public sector compensation. There are places where public sector compensation froze almost in tandem with private sector. And that was in states that don't have the same level of collective bargaining. I'll give you an example. In 2008, the same week that Governor Patterson unveiled his budget, he unveiled his plan for closing what was then an $11 billion budget gap in 15 months. And he expressed the hope for the first of several times. He said, well, I've asked state workers, I want to talk about whether we can forego the scheduled raise for next March. And he was asking, the answer was no. He threatened layoffs, he backed off, and the dance continued inconclusively for the next 2 years. Meanwhile, another large state had a scheduled pay increase of the same amount to take place almost the same time for its employees. The governor of that state, the same week, announced a 5-step program to close his state's growing budget gap in the middle of what was for them a biennium, a budget biennium. And item 1 was we're going to do this. Item 2 is we're going to do that. Item 3 is we're doing this other thing. Item 4 was, that raise for state workers, that's not happening. Item 5, something else. It was done. Now, was this governor some right-wing union-busting lunatic? No, he's the guy who's now chairman of the National Democratic Committee. He was the governor of Virginia. Virginia, of course, not only doesn't collectively bargain, it prohibits public sector collective bargaining. He had the freedom that the CEO of a large corporate firm had to say, holes developed, the bottom's falling out.
So what should the metric be? You've made comparisons between the public and the private sector. Is that a relationship, or is that a comparison that should be consistent over time, or should the metric be that when there's a recession and tax revenues go down, each area of the budget should go down, including employee compensation? Or should the metric be how can we make sure we're providing the compensation that we need to get workers who will do the job well? What should the metric be? Just briefly, if you would, both of you.
Well, one suggestion is that you hear a lot is, you got to have larger rainy day funds to carry you through downturns. Former New York State budget director once observed the problem with rainy day funds is that the legislature and the governor tend to think it's always raining. In fact, including funds socked away, deliberately overstated Medicaid expenditures, George Pataki left Eliot Spitzer a budget surplus of at least, I think it was in the neighborhood of $3.5 billion. Some claim it was even more. By the time David Patterson took office, that cushion was down below $1.5 billion. Because, in fact, the economic slide began to visibly affect state revenues during Spitzer's 1 full year as governor. And there was not a holy cow moment where they said, we've got to reverse gears. They depleted the surplus. By the time it was really raining cats and dogs, all they had left was the final cushion they didn't want to yank out from under the rubble because that would have left them with nothing to spare. So I don't think, whatever the solution is in answer to your question, I don't think the frequent answer of bigger rainy day funds and reserves actually tends to work in practice.
What should be the metric for?
Well, Governor Pataki did leave a decent cushion for Elliott Spitzer. He also had built up a good cushion in the late 90s that helped us get through the problems of the early 2000 decade in a better way. And he also did something that a lot of people opposed. I don't know if you did, but a lot of advocacy groups opposed Governor Pataki's big one-shot in 2003, the tobacco securitization settlement, to close that gap. I said at the time that given the magnitude of the gap he was facing, which was about $11.5 billion, that the tobacco securitization brought the gap down to manageable proportions, and it was worth doing it. I think it amounted to a kind of evening out the business cycle. But let me just go back to collective bargaining, because EJ mentioned Virginia, which was one of the 5 states without collective bargaining. All 5 of the states that do not allow collective bargaining have large deficits. 2 of them, Texas and North Carolina, have deficits which as a percentage of their general funds are among the highest in the country. The 5 states that don't have deficits, all 5 of the states that do not face projected deficits, all have collective bargaining. So I don't think that there is a relationship one way or another between collective bargaining and a budget situation. I think it's like Governor Christie says, it depends how you use collective bargaining and what you do.
That anticipates what was going to be my next question, so let me just ask you a little further about that. And you've already partly answered the question, but critics of the current collective bargaining systems for public employees in a number of states have quoted Franklin Roosevelt and George Meany, among others, as saying that collective bargaining does not make sense in the public sector. On the other hand, and most federal employees are not unionized. Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, wrote recently, on the other hand, that collective bargaining is a vehicle to improve services, whether in education or other areas, and it would hurt both workers and those they serve if that important right was lost. Does collective bargaining improve services? Frank? And we'll go to AJ.
I don't know. I don't think it has a negative effect on services. I think in education it might have a positive effect, and it might in other cases as well. If the bargaining includes discussion of things like class size, and teachers unions have been supporters of smaller class sizes, and smaller class sizes, I think, are good for the quality of education. I think a lot of what the Campaign for Fiscal Equity lawsuit was about, because it focused specifically on the New York City school system, that, as the court said, the instrumentalities of learning were not adequate to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to achieve a sound basic education. And I think that if there are interests that the teachers have, those interests are, in many cases, maybe even in most cases, going to be coincident with things that are good for the quality of education. But I don't think that's the major basis on which we should decide whether or not we should have collective bargaining or not.
Okay. EJ, unless you want to say something else in response to what Frank said, Frank has referred a couple of times to the CFE decision. I think there's a common perception that education spending in New York is relatively high, in part because we have a teachers union that is politically influential. Whether that's the case or not, it clearly is the case that the Court of Appeals felt it necessary, at least with regard to New York City, to order additional funding beyond what had been decided upon through the political process. What do we make of all of that?
Well, I actually don't think that we're high solely because of the teachers' union's power, because I think we've been comparatively high in school spending for a long time, including the time before teacher unions really came into their own. Whenever I think of teacher unions, I think of that. Remember the Woody Allen movie Sleeper, with the guy who wakes up in the future? He says, "What happened?" We think a man named Albert Shanker got hold of a nuclear device.
A nut named Albert Shanker.
A nut named Albert. It wasn't. You remember the quote exactly? But be that as it may, and where Shanker stood in the popular pantheon at that point in the 1970s, they were in part a part of that, and in part we just had a tradition of spending a lot more. CFE started in the early 90s on the heels of an era in which New York City schools spending had begun to be reduced. The city's own spending on its schools had begun to be reduced in nominal terms under a Democratic mayor, David Dinkins, in a fiscal crisis, and had reached what was for that point a recent low point, like a low point since the fiscal crisis, I believe. That's when the lawsuit started. Now, the irony about the lawsuit is it's only about New York City. Its liftoff point was the level of spending the city was doing and the state's own level of aid to the city circa 1993-4, which you'll find is like a recent historic low. By the time the court case came to conclusion, totally independent of the case largely, there had been a huge increase in the city's own spending on education, in part because the mayor was getting ready to run for U.S. Senate, among other things. Also, there had been, during the economic expansion of the late 90s, increases in state aid. So while it still didn't quite satisfy the plaintiffs in that case, the situation had changed markedly. By the time the final decision came down at the end of 2006, which more or less said, well, yeah, what you're doing is, it looks like it's okay. At that point, Michael Bloomberg had been mayor for 5 years and had further dumped loads of money into the schools. So at this point, it barely resembled what it had been in the beginning. And then Governor Spitzer surprised a lot of people, and don't take it from me, you'll find a story in the Times by, I don't remember who wrote it, which one of the Capitol Bureau here that wrote it, about how Spitzer had surprised people by the alacrity with which he had jumped out the week after that decision and said, I'm going to have a big settlement to CFE. When during the campaign he had avoided taking a position on it, and the court had basically just told him, you're off the hook in terms of being forced to do anything. Prior to Spitzer, every governor prior to Spitzer in both parties, no matter what sounds they wanted to make about education and how much they cared about it and where they were, as a bottom line budgetary matter, always took a very tight approach to school aid because it was the one biggest piece of the budget that they could most directly control through the appropriations process. They'd come in very low, taking the political hit for being stingy, in order to keep down the final result. Spitzer just broke the mold and said, here, I promise you for 5 years, a big hunk of money, which was, even under those economic projections that year, which were grossly optimistic, it couldn't be paid for, and as Frank observed, actually it wasn't paid for. Now, I think Frank and I would differ on whether it should have been paid for or should just simply not have been done. But that was kind of like the problem with that. And when you get down to the instrumentalities of education, textbooks, nickel and dime stuff. Buildings, well, especially the cost of building them in New York City, that's pretty expensive, but that had already been done by the time the decision had been. They'd spent millions of dollars on buildings.
That was in the process of being done.
Well,
they had reached an agreement on it in 2005 or 2006, but the New York City facilities improvement process.
Oh, they had spent billions by then.
Yeah, they had, but there was still more that needed to be done.
They did a lot in the late 90s.
But you were going to say that beyond those things...
Beyond those things, the way you spend the instrumentality of education is the body in the classroom. That's where, by the end of the day, the way you spend money in education is not by stuffing it in kids' pockets. You hire people and you pay them. It's the ultimate human services issue. And that's ultimately what CFE is about. It's about teachers, how many, how well paid, how deployed. And the reason the city's education spending has increased massively, go check the numbers, it's up enormously, is because Bloomberg chose it as his priority. I'm not necessarily boosting this in the raw sense, by the way, a lot of the ways he did it. But Bloomberg decided his legacy would be in hiring lots of teachers and in doing a contract deal in his first year with UFT that began a major, major boost in UFT salaries.
Let me switch topics if I could. One of the big issues in other states and in New York is pensions. And the New York Times had an editorial on Sunday. Now, a number of newspapers around the state, the Buffalo News, certainly the New York Post, some others have been saying for quite a while that we need to limit spending in general and the cost of public employee compensation specifically. It was a little more surprising when the New York Times wrote this editorial, among other things, saying that we ought to change the pension system so that full retirement age would be 65, and the use of overtime in calculating pensions, that's probably less controversial. And they said, at least giving consideration to the idea of a defined contribution or 401k type pension plan. EJ, I know you have been the leading advocate of changing that, and I'll go back to you in a moment, but Frank, is that a good idea? Going to a defined contribution pension plan?
I think it is, as you said, it's one of EJ's major objectives. I think that it's sort of similar to the Social Security debate, that the claim is that somehow Social Security you're going to help the financing of Social Security if you turn to private accounts. It doesn't help the financing of Social Security at all. It changes the way the money gets invested, and it in effect benefits the mutual fund industry. John Vogel, the founder of Vanguard, has consistently spoken out very strongly in opposition to changing Social Security in the direction of private accounts managed by mutual fund companies. I think that I don't think that over time that the kind of defined contribution plan, let's take the one that was recently adopted by Utah, I think for regular employees, EJ had a fellow from Utah here as a speaker, for regular employees it's a 10% contribution, and for public safety it's 13%. 12 or 13. Okay. If you look at the history...
It's the contribution the employer makes?
What?
That's the employer.
That's the employer contribution, and I think 3% by the employee in the Utah plan. If you look at the history of our defined benefit plan, there have been, since the mid-1980s, there's only been a handful of years in which contributions have been above 5%. I think what you find is a defined benefit plan for a given amount of money, it produces a much greater benefit because of the central investment. I think the decentralization of investment in a defined of investment management in a defined contribution plan is the big problem. About 10 years ago, Nebraska had a pension study done. They by chance had side by side two systems. One which was a defined contribution and one which was a defined benefit plan. And what they found is while the two systems had cost them about the same amount of money, that the workers who were in the defined contribution system were ending up much worse off than the people in the defined benefit program. Frontline did a 1-hour documentary special on this. You can Google Frontline, Nebraska pension system, and read about it, and the Nebraska study is available on the internet as well. So I think that just as in Social Security, it's a diversion. It doesn't solve the problem that's being complained about.
Well, I strongly disagree with that.
I know.
It's not like Social Security.
Is Frank correct to say that the investment costs are higher?
Well, it depends. If you look at the SUNY plan or not. I mean, basically the companies, you have several large nationwide companies that are selling primarily an annuitized version of a retirement plan, and they're marketing it, and it's essentially subsumed in the plan they're offering. I would say that, and 62% of SUNY faculty who are all unionized choose it, and are doing fine with it.
Doesn't it depend on when you retire and how much time you have to devote to all this?
Not if you annuitize, Frank. Now, here's the other thing. The Nebraska plan. They talk about the Nebraska. Nebraska had, this is all about plan design as much as anything. The Nebraska plan was terrible. It was this prehistoric, stupid 401k type design in which a default plan was essentially a money market, and most of them were in it. And then it was that they measured the performance of that plan after the biggest stock market boom in history, compared the pension, the defined benefit pension for the judges and cops who were in their defined benefit plan, and said, wow, they've got a bigger benefit. Well, yeah, no kidding. I mean, this is, look, and you talked about the contribution being not much higher than 5 for many years. What goes up, what comes down goes up, and vice versa. That was completely artificial. That was below the actuarial normal cost of those benefits. I mean, who are we kidding? We're now going to be up above 20% for much of the next decade. That's because you don't get away with that forever. And that generation of taxpayers got away with staffing up schools and hiring lots of people and saying, hey, guess what? I can give you a guaranteed benefit of 65% of final average salary when you leave in your late 50s, and I don't have to pay anything for it. Isn't that great? And now this generation of taxpayers, that generation of parents and school districts says, yes, hire more teachers. It's cheap. Okay? This generation of parents and taxpayers gets to pay for it. Because what we pay for the risk-free benefit they got. And the teacher retirement system contribution by 2015 is going to be in the neighborhood of 25%, which it hasn't been since 1980.
I think we don't have as good a crystal ball to say that.
We have the math. It's easy. I mean, they didn't challenge my estimate on that, Frank. I've talked to them, TRS. They just refused to go out that far. Why they refused publicly to go out that far, I don't know. But it's going up. If they make 11% a year average over the next 4 years, maybe we'll luck out and it'll be up only to 20 or 21%. But it's going to be more than twice what it is now.
Well, we're glad you agree on the defined contribution idea.
So we're totally for it otherwise.
Let's pose a couple other questions. What should the retirement age be?
It should be 65, if not higher.
For what kind of jobs? I think the problem with the retirement age, because
that's a good question too.
This is an issue for Social Security as well. I think that for people who do the kinds of jobs that EJ and I do, I mean, we can keep, as long as we avoid Alzheimer's disease, we can do these jobs. But carpenters and nurses' aides have a harder time.
True.
So should the state have a higher retirement age than it has now for certain white-collar workers, but a lower retirement age for CSA members?
I don't know. I don't think that I have the ability to say what that should be. You can retire at 55 now. Is that correct?
I believe so. I can't, but some people can.
No. What age can you retire at?
It's 62.
At 62?
New hires at 62.
Not just new hires.
Well, if you got 30 at 55.
Without
retire
counting.
at 55 at 30.
20 years of service.
55 and 30 without counting.
Tier 4 is 55 at 30.
I knew we'd get the audience involved.
Right, yeah. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Say that again?
You can retire under Tier 4 at 55 with a reduced benefit. Whether you have 30 years or not, 30 years just guarantees you a benefit of no reduction, 60%.
All right.
No reduction.
Paying in after
No
10
reduction
years.
at 55.
Okay.
No reduction from what level?
30 years.
No, but
From 2%. From 2% multiplier.
2%.
okay, yeah. And so for people now who are starting state service at 62,
It's 62.
okay, and you can work longer, and do you have an early, and then occasionally you have early retirement option.
Regularly, it seems you have early
Right.
retirement options.
Oh, yeah.
Well, there's some rumbling in the audience. I think we'll move on. Let me go to another sometimes controversial question. The Taylor Law starts by with this statement of policy. It is the public policy of the state and and the purpose of this act to promote harmonious and cooperative relationships between government and its employees, and to protect the public by assuring at all times the orderly and uninterrupted operations and functions of government. I know Pauline has memorized that, and others here probably know it by heart, but I have to read it. So one of the results of the enactment of the law, including the Triborough Amendment, has been a significant reduction in the number of strikes by public employee unions. Is that an argument for keeping the law and the Triborough Amendment in place?
Well, you're saying since the enactment?
Well, it's more since the enactment of the Triborough Amendment, not from the enactment of the Taylor Law.
Correct.
Well, because there were a lot of strikes in the first decade or so of the Taylor Law.
Or the Triborough Doctrine.
I guess a couple of questions. I suspect we know where you two would come down on Triborough. If you want to talk about that, that's fine. But more broadly, we're hearing people in other states essentially saying we ought to, if not entirely get rid of public employee collective bargaining, we ought to scale it back dramatically. Is that a good idea or not? Or for that matter, should we get rid of it entirely?
Well, I think that probably for a lot of people in this room would rewrite the sleeper script to say a nut named Scott Walker got hold of nuclear weapons. He did. He got a majority in both houses, and he's looking to radically scale back collective bargaining all the way down to the level that exists in the federal government.
So what should we do here, though?
Well, what can we do, or what should we do?
What should we do?
Well, what should we do is related to what we can do, because the fact is, if a governor here was to propose something like that, he'd get nowhere and create a bad environment for trying to get anything else done anyway. So because the political situation here is different, I think what should be done is on the order of the mandate relief agenda that's been supported by pretty much universally by the local government groups, particularly by the school boards, school administrators, and the mayors. And the mayors, by the way, I would note, a bipartisan coalition of mayors, Democrats as well as Republicans, crossing ideological lines, and that is to make some structural changes or repairs to the Taylor Law, which would include repeal or modification of Triborough, modification of compulsory arbitration, a modification of some recent PERB rulings. It's too bad Bill can't say anything.
If we repeal Triborough, should we expect more strikes?
I'm not sure whether that's the case, because if you look at the national statistics on strikes, if somebody looked just at strike activity in New York, and it's ironic, by the way, because as you know, if you read all the history associated with the Taylor Law, Rockefeller's main goal was labor peace. There was no labor peace, principally in New York City, which had already given its workers collective bargaining rights. We need to give workers collective bargaining rights because in New York City, where they have collective bargaining rights, they have too many strikes, so we'll give them collective bargaining rights, which was followed by 10 years of strikes, especially in school districts. Now, if you looked in New York, you might say, if you just looked at the New York stats, you might say, well, the strikes stopped once the Triborough Doctrine became enmeshed in law. That must have been the reason. Except if you look at the national stats, exactly the same thing happened every place at the same time. And nobody's been able to prove this. I can't find any way to prove it. But you want to look at a time, you look at Reagan breaking the air traffic controller strike, and boom, there's no more strikes anywhere. I mean, the strike activity nationally dropped off. Strikes became atypical, private and public sector. Yeah, was there a booming economy that kind of made it less necessary? Yes. That was a big part of it too, right at the same moment. But I don't think you can say Triborough was necessarily the reason either. I'm sure.
Greg, you want to talk about Triborough? Or
Yeah, in a way. I think you need, one of the essential goals of the Taylor Law is stability in government services to prevent disruptions in government services. And I think the law has been effective in doing that. I think that it might be Ronald Reagan's symbolism that changed the world, but it also might not be. And I think it's very risky to change things that are working. I think, in effect, and I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to me that what the mayors want is simply to take a situation which they feel favors the workers and tilt it to favoring them. Right now, employers and employee organizations bargain. They collectively bargain, they negotiate, and if an agreement expires, before a new agreement is reached, the terms of the existing agreement remain in law. I think the mayors, the grass is always greener on the other side of the street. I think they think it's a magic bullet, and they want to have the playing field tilted in their direction a little more. I think that even at the current system, there are employers who don't bargain in good faith and get sanctioned on occasion. And I think that if you repealed the Triborough Amendment or amended it to say that the salary provisions of the contract didn't continue, the so-called step increases, that there would be more employers who wouldn't bargain in good faith and who would drag things out. So I think that it's, to a degree, inside baseball. And the mayors want something which would be good for them, but it doesn't mean it's good for society.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open the floor to all the smart folks in the audience. And Bill Herbert has a microphone. We would ask you to use the microphone, identify yourself, and ask a question. Do not make a speech. So my final question is, EJ, you touched on the issue that mayors of both parties are seeking similar things in regard to their budgets and to some extent collective bargaining issues. In Wisconsin and Ohio and some other states, we see very sharp divisions between the Republican elected officials and the Democratic officials, with the Republicans pushing pretty hard on these issues and the Democratic officials trying to protect existing rights. How would you describe the relative positions of the two parties in New York on these issues?
More different from Wisconsin on the state level than the local level. I would bet that in Wisconsin and in Ohio, there's many more than a few local officials who are Democrats who are at least secretly rooting on the changes that Walker wants for the same reason the mayors here want. I think Frank's right. That's what they want, and I think it would be good. At the state level, it's been said about Wisconsin, not so much about Ohio. You may have read this, but in Wisconsin, and I've spoken to a few people in Wisconsin who agree to this, that in Wisconsin, you'll find more really, Democrats are more like real Democrats, and Republicans are more like real Republicans. There tends to be more of a stark divide, not really even ideological, just an old-fashioned Republican and a Democrat. And you're seeing that play out in Wisconsin. Now, you may have noted, I didn't realize this until recent news coverage, in Ohio, they've never lost the right to strike. And one of the big things they're upset about is that Kasich, the governor, wants to actually repeal, wants to make strikes illegal in Ohio, which, of course, I don't think we would say that was a terrible thing. Maybe nobody in the room even would say that was a terrible thing. So I do think here Republicans are different in that sense, although I think you're beginning to see a little more movement in some parts of the legislature here and there in the Senate. I guess the moment when you really, if you had Republicans here more like Republicans in Wisconsin, and they control the legislature, and the governor was, say, Steve Levy, you might be seeing the same things, except given this role of New York City and all this, you still wouldn't be seeing it unless the governor had excluded New York City completely from any change you would see in the making law.
Okay.
I guess the progressive streak in Wisconsin Republicanism of the LaFollettes has completely disappeared, that the Republican Party has been cleansed of progressives?
I don't think the Republican Party of Wisconsin's been that progressive for a long time.
Right.
And I can show you a quote, I'm sorry to bring it with me, from the socialist who was mayor of Milwaukee when they did collective bargaining rights in Wisconsin in 1959. He wrote a piece in a magazine, Professional Labor Relations Specialist magazine, a few years after he left office. He was a socialist. And he was mayor for over a decade.
Back when it was okay to call yourself a socialist.
Yeah, with a capital S. That was the party line he ran on. Who talked about the change that collective bargaining had made in the governance of the city like Milwaukee that he had run, and how he was now, essentially, you now had another party involved in co-managing with you, and it become sort of what he called a third house of government.
Is that co-managing a good thing, Frank, or not a good thing, or it depends?
I think it depends on how it's done, but I think that government is going to work better always if it taps the expertise of its workers.
Well, on that note, we're going to tap the expertise of our audience, or at least the questions of our audience, if anybody has any. And if not, we can continue talking up here, but we fortunately have a gentleman over here. We'll have the microphone in just a couple of seconds. And I know there are people in this room who don't want to get behind the other room, so.
Hi. The question I have is mainly for Matt. I guess well-known economics reporter for the New York Times, the economics and business reporter, I don't know how to pronounce his name, David Lee.
David Leonard?
Yeah, Leonard.
Steve Greenhouse?
Recently wrote an article that is about a number of things involved in collective bargaining. But one point says, no wonder that academic papers spanning more than 30 years have found that government workers receive compensation that is similar, with somewhat lower salaries and somewhat better benefits on average, to that of private sector workers with similar qualifications.
Yeah, I remember that article, and I could show him other studies that don't find quite that.
But he's, in this case, summarizing, apparently all of the academic papers. And I was looking at
see
other
what his
summaries.
list is.
But I looked at other summaries too, and then recently, another reporter for the New York Times, Stephen Greenhouse, that most people know, the labor reporter, wrote an article saying essentially the same thing. And these are not the editorial writers of the New York Times. These are the people that are supposedly supposed to be objective and understanding technical issues here. He said exactly the same thing, and was interviewed on Gross on NPR. I forgot Terry Gross.
So we have two New York Times writers who say that the claim that public sector workers get paid more. So
Who have claimed to have reviewed all of the papers?
Well, there's not actually. I was a little mystified as to what Leonard in particular was talking about, because it was not. This is one of the trickiest areas to measure. Number one, number two. There was not a wealth of research on this before a couple of years ago, and going back decades. Well, back decades, the compensation structure was different anyway. I don't think there's any. The raw data nationwide. There's no question. The newest data just came out from BLS today. Go online and get it. There's the raw data, which does not differentiate by occupation, age, or educational level, unquestionably shows higher compensation than the state and local sectors. Understood. Just a minute. Just a minute. That's why I'm peeling the onion for you. Okay, it's 44% higher generally state and local. Number one. Number two, you missed another one just today. John Liu, the controller of the city of New York, put out yet another study purporting to show that. I wrote a lengthy blog post on it at nytorch.com, that compensation for city workers was not higher than private sector workers. Now, what he actually showed in his study, which has been found by all studies, and by the way, his own study, notwithstanding the misleading headline on his press release, showed, stressed, and admitted generalizations are not possible. Here's why. If you look at low-wage, uneducated workers and high school graduate workers up to the associate degree level, there's absolutely no question in all the data I've seen and in the New York City study that public sector workers earn more flat out just in terms of the pay without even getting the benefits. That's the case virtually everywhere. I've never seen any study not showing that.
But things could be different for more highly educated.
Highly educated people, you come into a different set of measures, but the tools are inexact. Let me tell you about my critique of Liu's study. He says that...
Actually, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I don't want to
go into it. The postgraduate, is every postgraduate degree alike? The dominant holders of postgraduate degrees in the government sector are teachers. And most teachers, and 98% of 95% of teachers are in the public sector. So the comparisons are very inexact. The benefits, there's just no question.
Frank, do you want to comment on this?
I don't think there's any question about it in the public sector.
No, I'm sorry. Well, we're going to go move on. Frank, do you want to say anything on this?
Maybe later.
Okay.
We better let this rest for a minute.
If we can, we'll get back to it, but we'll see. Let's go to Peter, and then so I can see whether there's been back there.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Peter Murphy. Just two quick points. Frank, you mentioned a $13.5 billion gap from the tax cuts from the 90s that were kind of...
In other words, using the methodology that the Budget Division used through the Pataki era, where they would annually publish the list of the tax cuts and how much they were worth.
Right.
What I did was carry that. They don't publish it anymore. They still might do it. So what I did was carry that forward, taking the economic decline into consideration and the temporary tax increase. And what my estimate is while the tax cut, while Pataki was probably right that the tax cuts were reducing revenue by about $20 billion when he left office, my estimate is that's 13.5 now.
So question is, should the state raise taxes 13.5 billion?
No.
What effect might that have? That was my first question. And then quickly, isn't the guaranteed pension system self-defeating in steering more and more tax money to cover that and leaving less for other things like salary increases?
But the reason it's steering more and more tax money to the contributions has not been addressed. It was because of the financial shenanigans of the investment houses and the losses that pension funds and institutional investors suffered. And in New York and Rhode Island are the only two states where pension funds don't have the ability to go to court and seek redress.
There's a question back in the middle on the side here.
Stan Winter. Two questions. One really just came up with after Peter's comment, which talks about the pension fund. One of my problems with discussions about the retirement system and the pension fund, that its history begins with the late 80s and the 1990s, and all increases are talked about since then. If you go back historically to the pension system in the mid-50s, when I joined it, the annual contribution made by employers was around 10%. Same was true for employees, depending upon age and sex when you join the system. So historically, employers should be contributing about 10%. When we get into the 90s and they were charged nothing, even the 1% administrative fee was canceled. We talk about the increases since then. And you talk about the rainy day funds. Paul McCall, before he left office, in fact, the last 2 years that he was in office, warned the employers that the party was over, that things ought to be done. So that's...
Do you want to ask a question?
Well, the question is, that was really a comment because it just responded to him.
Do you want to ask a question?
My original question had to do with the defined contribution plans. 5 states that have the worst record in terms of housing problems, Nevada, California, Florida, Arizona, and I think Texas is the 5th one, are those that are heavily populated by retirees. Retirees who lost considerable amount of monies in their 401ks and in what basically is a defined contribution plan. Now, if we move to a defined contribution plan, aren't we going to be risking having the same problem on a national basis? I mean, the rationale to do it because management in the private sector is doing it to get out of their obligations. Doesn't seem to be a justification for doing it for public employees.
Do you want to take that first, Frank?
Yeah, I think that unfortunately, the number of private employers offering either defined benefit or defined contribution plans is declining. So the private sector is not operating in a socially responsible way when it comes to retirement security. I think what you're saying is insightful, and I think what it means is that the advocates of the government moving to defined contribution plans want to make sure that retirees from the public sector get to share their the same angst that the people from the private sector have. as long as they get their commissions.
Well, let me go back to I tried a couple times earlier to ask what are the metrics we should use to compare these things. And in this case, should the metric be the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, so that if the great majority of people in the private sector don't have something, then neither should people in the public? Or should the metric be, I think this is what you're suggesting, Frank, that the public sector ought to have its own sense of what is the right way to do it, and it doesn't matter what's happening in the private sector?
Yeah, I don't think that public sector, private sector comparisons should allow us to exacerbate the income and wealth gaps that exist in the country. I think that the advocates of private accounts are using the situation of economic insecurity to foster hostility towards public employees.
Look, two things I want to go into. First of all, a bit about commissions, Frank. I'm not going to take that.
Okay.
Wall Street loves the defined benefit pension system. Open your eyes. They're big, big friends of the public pension funds, okay? They like things just the way they are. Okay? This is not, that is absolutely, to say that this has to do with somebody out to make a buck, I think is not only unfair, it's wrong.
What do you think about it in Social Security?
I'm of mixed mind.
No. Do you think that the investment firms want private accounts in Social Security?
I don't know, and I don't care because it's a different debate. This is a different debate.
There's some
that want one and some want the other. I mean, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley don't want to be in the business of selling retail accounts to people. Okay, they're totally uninterested in that. They like things just the way they are. Because you know how these people are market makers. These public pension funds. You think that some bureaucrat down the street is doing all that?
No,
that's not the way it works.
No, I was asking about Social Security.
This is not about Social Security.
Right.
It's about plan design.
What's your next point?
It's ultimately about plan design. If you've got a well-designed plan, and I would say look at the SUNY plan, okay? It's a good plan design. And I'm not saying you can nickel and dime this. And I've repeatedly said this. I've written it, I've said it in discussions with you. I'm not saying you can nickel and dime this and come up with some cruddy 401k like your local hardware store has and put 2% into it and then suspend it every few years. I'm saying I'd be comfortable with something where the employer was putting in 8, say, so a level 8.
Utah is too generous?
No, I mean 10's okay too. Okay. I pay 10 just if I got agreement to it, I pay the 10. Okay. You put in 10, you have the employee put in at least 5, whether he or she likes it or not. And you have a well-designed plan, you work for 40 years and you put 15% into a plan that's well-designed, that has got life cycle features built into it, or better yet, is annuitized. If you're a security freak, you're going to be fine. Okay.
All right, let's go on to
so you
questions.
think the Utah, well, not Utah.
I think Utah plan is ingenious.
And you think the Nebraska one was not
The Nebraska plan was bad, very bad.
I'm going to go on to a couple of questions, Pauline, and then Jim.
I just wonder, Mr. McMahon, if you would...
Pauline, mind speaking to the microphone?
Oh, sorry. Pauline Kinsella. I just wonder if you would support the proposition that in a defined benefit program, the employer would make a minimum matching contribution to, say, 3.5%, which is what under Tier 5 is now going to be required. Whether a matching minimum contribution from the employer should be required regardless of the state of the assets of the pension plan. And that brings the whole issue of smoothing and correction against downturns in the market to a closer correction.
I think that that's one of those if men were angels questions, and I think it's just like rainy day funds. If you had a minimum contribution of 4 or 5% required to the New York State Pension Fund during the 1990s, guess what? It would be taken. The benefits would have been sweetened, or the money would have been, if possible, raked off if the court would have let them in some other way. There is no there's no state in the nation in which you would have a pension fund with a $20 billion surplus, say, built up by 1999, in which the money would not disappear, probably overnight. In fact, that's what happened anyway.
It happened under the Pataki administration, as you will recall.
So what? I don't care. Since when am I don't care if it was a Pataki administration. I'm happy to blame for Pataki for that. I'll give you a sheaf of stuff in which I blame Pataki for everything but the bad weather.
Let's go on to.
I told you they're not this, so don't worry about it.
Well, EJ, was it temporary? In other words, was this one of the situations in which the controller as sole trustee sued and ultimately got the...
Well, that had to do with Puck, but I mean, but what I'm saying simply is, the controller reluctantly went along with Pataki's giveaway of the pension sweeteners in 2000. Okay, and Rudy did his own sweeteners at the same time.
I'm going to ask that we have a question from Jim. There was a hand in the back, and then we're going to be pretty close to our time. Go ahead, Jim.
Jim Poling. I'm an economist who likes to provide empirical works to kind of settle disputes like this, and very hard. But one issue in which I'm sure you disagree is on the likelihood of a serious fiscal crisis in the next 10 years, like Illinois or California. What kind of evidence do you think would alter your opinion about that? And EJ, what's the best evidence you can offer to him to suggest that there's really some serious trouble down the road?
In New York State?
Yeah.
What makes you think there's serious trouble? Just tell us, rather than having us guess.
Well, I honestly,
what do you think?
It's a very different. I can tell you, I spent a lot of time on extreme events in housing and mortgage markets.
Right.
It's a very difficult thing for people to come to grips with.
Very difficult. I think what you're asking for is like a stress test, because I don't think
stress test is one example.
You think that there's something bad in the horizon in the next 10 years?
So I can't prove it, as you said.
Well, do you think there is?
Oh, I think with a question of probability or possibility.
Right. What do you think the probability is?
Let's say 10%.
Okay, I would agree with you.
Huh.
I don't know.
There's got to be at least a 10% probability.
At least 10. I'm not saying I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either for sure. But would that affect your view? I mean, if it was.
It is my view. I'm agreeing with you.
Huh. And what would be the pension implications if we had another drop like that? I mean, that's kind of the.
Yeah, it depends what the calamity is. We've handled. I mean, New York has been pretty stable. I think one of the things that Moody's said in a report on the state's finances, this goes contrary to the governor saying having these projected deficits. I think a lot of people, probably not the people in this audience, get confused because we're talking about the federal government having a deficit and the state government's having a deficit. The terms are used in very different ways. The federal government's deficit is a real deficit. It's red ink. The states face projected deficits, and one of the things that Moody's has praised New York's fiscal management for is that we manage those deficits. We close them. We're successful in eliminating them. I think that I take a different view than the governor. The governor said he thinks that this idea of having the projected structural deficits fuels greater spending. I think it's problematical from the other direction, is I think these projected deficits dampen needed spending. If you, back before the governor said he had discovered this, that there was these, what he called a sham, that we didn't really have a deficit. On January 31st, he said, we don't really have a $10 billion deficit. And in his letter to the newspapers, he said, and I myself have been guilty of using that number. We really only have a $1 billion deficit. And the following day, he submitted a budget to close a $10 billion deficit. What I think he was getting at, and I think cuts in the other direction, is the budget division, as EJ alluded to very early in this session, attempts, it's not a true current services budget. They attempt to say, what would it cost to do next year what we're doing this year? But it's also a current law type budget. In other words, what promises do we have on the books, like the CFE settlement or tax cuts expiring? And in November, they projected a $9 billion deficit for the coming year. It didn't mean we were $9 billion in the red. But what it meant was that the way they got to that $9 billion deficit, because they were projecting revenue to grow by $2.5 billion, and for us I don't know if you know this or not, but this year we're paying $2 billion of last year's bills.
Frank, can I interrupt you for a
So
second?
let me just finish.
What you're trying to say in response to Jim's question is that we do manage our way out of these problems in one way or another. Is that correct?
Okay, so we're paying $2 billion of last year's bills this year. But what that $9 billion gap was based on was general fund spending growing by $12.5 billion, or 23%. Now, I don't think there was any chance in the world that general fund spending was going to grow by 23%. So in effect, they projected a deficit and said, the governor said, and he was right, we wouldn't have a deficit if we froze spending. But he's not proposing to freeze school aid. He's proposing to cut school aid by $1.5 billion compared to last year.
I'd like to go to the final question in the back.
During this discussion, I think there were moments when there was a lack of definitional discussion. And one of those things, it's the defined contribution versus the defined benefit. So before I ask that question, I just want to make sure I'm understanding. Defined benefit would be something like the Social Security system where you put in whatever people contribute. I know when I retire, I get a certain amount out of the Social Security system. That's defined benefit versus defined contribution into a 401k or something where you're not sure what ultimately your outcome is going to be.
That's correct. That's essentially correct.
If that's correct, then I think that your own discussion of, I guess, of what happened in Nebraska or kind of undermines the argument for defined contribution, because I know, I'm speaking in very simple lay terms. I know that with respect to the U.S. government telling me we have this program for you, and you put this money in, you'll get this benefit. I don't have to know how they've invested that. They owe me that benefit, and put in very simple terms, they're going to have to figure out how they get that to me, because the contract is, I get that benefit. With the contribution, you've already been saying, in not your words exactly, but the impression I'm getting is, well, they were stupid. That was a bad plan. Well, in 50 states, are all 50 states going to have brilliant plans? Are you going to have idiots here and there who are going to do a bad plan, and therefore I get less benefit? I want the situation that I have with the United States. You screw up, you figure it out, I get that benefit. I don't want the other situation where you screwed up, and, well, too bad you didn't elect the right people to make the right decisions, so you get screwed, you lose your benefit. Can you, would you respond, I guess, to
I just simply say the solution is for people who really want to be very secure, and want to have no maintenance, and they want to have a defined benefit, there's two options. One is a pure defined contribution plan that is simply an upfront annuity. That is the favored option of most people who are in the defined contribution side of the SUNY plan through the TIAA traditional annuity plan. That's a plan you put money into, and then when you retire, money comes out. And it's not based on market performance. There's some interest rate fluctuations during your career, but you get a stream of income. Well, that's what's in there. Secondly, the second option is a hybrid, where there's a sharing of risk, where the employer's contribution is fixed and capped, doesn't go up and doesn't go down. It actually addresses your point about setting a minimum level. When there's periods of market overperformance, what is not needed from the part of the employer contribution that's not needed in the DB side goes over to the DB side, the DC side. In other words, in the 90s, you would have had like 8 percentage points go into DC account. That's part of the hybrid. When the market demands a bigger contribution, if the necessary contribution to the DB side of the plan goes up above the employer's maximum, then the employee has to contribute more to make up that difference.
Frank, you want to comment on that? And then
No, I think that's fine.
All right. Well, thank you again to the Labor Employment Relations Association. Thank you all for coming.